Verdant Force. For a time, this big green elemental was in the conversation for strongest creature in the game, and was famously referred to by one of the premier Magic writers at the time as the best fatty ever printed. The Force not only provides you with a huge body, it also spits out a saproling token during every player's upkeep. This allows it to quickly populate the board with an army to support its own massive 7/7 body. As good as Verdant Force once was, it's been a long time since it's been anywhere close to the best creature in Magic, and most of today's Magic players aren't particularly impressed by this card. After all, it hasn't seen competitive play in more than 2 decades, and a reprint in 2018's Dominaria didn't lead to it even seeing play in Standard. So that begs the question, how good was Verdant Force, actually? This video is sponsored by Card Kingdom. Use the links in the description to visit their store. Hi everyone, I'm Nitsahone, and welcome to another episode of How Good Was It?, a series where I do a deep dive into a single competitive card's history, generally focusing on cards whose best competitive days are behind them. Today's card was chosen by you, the viewers, in a poll I posted on the community tab. I hadn't done a green card in the series so far, so I pitted 2 powerful green creatures from Magic's early days against one another, Djinn and Verdant Force, and in the end, the Force came out on top. So, let's answer the question so many of you want to know. How good was Verdant Force, actually? Verdant Force was printed in 1997's Tempest, and players were immediately impressed by it. Before Verdant Force, the best expensive green creature was probably Alpha's Force of Nature. While it is cheaper to cast overall and larger too, it came at the cost of spending 4 green mana at the beginning of your upkeep, otherwise it turned around and punched you in the face. Verdant Force is on a whole other level. It might be more expensive and have smaller stats, but there's no downside at all in the text box, and the upside it has is amazing. Getting a saproling every upkeep means that most of the time before your opponent can ever do anything about it, the Force gives you a saproling, and if they didn't deal with it quickly, you'd have lots of saprolings that could pressure your opponent or protect you while you smashed in with the Force. The one problem with Verdant Force was that mana cost, but in every deck it's ever been successful in, that wasn't an issue. That's because upon being printed, the Force quickly became one of the first creatures players tried to cheat into play. After all, if you can get a Verdant Force into play ahead of schedule, your opponent doesn't stand much of a chance. Verdant Force made its major competitive debut on the biggest stage possible, the 1998 World Championship. At the time, Worlds consisted of playing a few different formats to determine the winner. At the 1998 Championship, Verdant Force was played in successful decks in 2 different formats, Block Constructed and Standard, and in both formats, it was played in the same kind of deck, a deck that represented 2 significant firsts in the history of competitive Magic. These decks use the engine of Survival of the Fittest and Recurring Nightmare. Survival lets you pay a green and discard a creature to search up a creature, and Recurring Nightmare is a repeatable source of reanimation that requires you to sacrifice a creature in play and return the nightmare to your hand. These decks, called Recurring Survival, were both the first Reanimator and the first toolbox deck to succeed at Magic's highest level of competition. Let's take a look at the block version of the deck first, as it used a smaller card pool. Only the 3 sets in Tempest block were legal. While Verdant Force didn't play much of a role in the toolbox side of things, instead it was the deck's main reanimation target. You could discard it with Survival, which you often did after searching it up, and then you could reanimate it with Recurring Nightmare. Verdant Force is a big part of why Reanimator decks became viable at the 1998 World Championship. Before this, there just weren't very many creatures around that were worth cheating into play like this. There were imposing creatures for sure, but most of them had downsides, and none of them could quickly snowball an advantage like the Force can. I mean, even if they eventually take it down, you're going to have saprolings that still make it hard for your opponent to win. Furthermore, the Force was immune to tons of removal in both block and standard. Mono Black and Mono Red were the other powerful decks in both formats, and Lightning Bolt and Diabolic Edict just couldn't get the job done against Verdant Force. This made it a lot less risky to go all in on getting the Force into play in the early game than pretty much any other expensive creature. As I mentioned earlier, recurring survival decks were also successful in Standard, with Verdant Force appearing in 4 of the top 8 decks at the championship, including the deck Brian Selden used to win the whole thing. In Standard, the Force was joined by Spirit of the Night, really the only other creature at the time worthy of being reanimated. The deck was dominant enough that Recurring Nightmare got banned out of Standard a few months later, and this also meant the end of the Force's success in the format, and it actually went quiet for quite some time, until 2001, when it experienced a resurgence in Extended. Extended was a rotating format with a much larger card pool than Standard. It featured the last several years of cards. To talk about Verdant Force in Extended, I have to introduce you to one of the more prolific Magic writers of the time, Jamie Wakefield. He wrote several books about competitive Magic and had a regular column on the Dojo, which was one of the main sources of online Magic content in the early 2000s. Wakefield was a professional player who had had some modest success, but his greatest strength was in writing really entertaining tournament reports. His writing was so good that he even published a book that was a collection of these reports. He didn't just write those reports though, he also brewed decks that he posted about in his weekly articles. This is something that's super commonplace now, but this was the early days of online Magic writing, and at the time he was one of the few who were writing this style of article. Wakefield loved big green creatures, and he's the one who labeled Verdant Force the best fatty ever printed. He did this in his article about a brand new extended deck that he called Secret Force. The game plan here was to get an early green creature into play, like Llanowar Elves, and then cast Natural Order to cheat Verdant Force into play. With a couple of mana elves, and the deck had access to 8 of them because of Fyndhorn Elves, you could pull this off on turn 3 with regularity. Just like in Standard a few years earlier, a Verdant Force this early in the game was very difficult to beat. This wasn't just theoretical either. After this deck was out in the open, Rafael Gennari piloted a Secret Force deck to a top 8 at Pro Tour New Orleans. By then, Verdant Force was joined by Spiritmonger as another creature to put into play with Natural Order. This wasn't the only way to cheat Verdant Force into play in Extended in 2001 either. 2 other decks in the top 8 at Pro Tour New Orleans were mono-black Reanimator decks. These decks, despite not running any green sources of mana, ran a singleton Verdant Force that could be put into the graveyard using Buried Alive or Entomb, and then brought back using Exhume or Reanimate. These decks were actually capable of getting Verdant Force into play even earlier than Secret Force decks were, since they Entomb on turn 1 and then Exhume or Reanimate on turn 2. Verdant Force continued to see play in both of these types of decks until 2003. But after 2003, Verdant Force never saw play again. This, despite being reprinted in 9th edition, 10th edition, and Dominaria. So, what happened? Why did Verdant Force go from being one of the best creatures to cheat into play in all of Magic to being a card that no one was cheating into play anywhere? Well, as we've seen in other episodes of this series about creatures, creature power creep is a very real thing. By the time Verdant Force got a reprint in 9th edition, which made it legal again in both Standard and Extended, decks weren't interested in cheating the Force into play. This role had been usurped by creatures like Akroma, Angel of Wrath, and Darksteel Colossus, who were played in Tooth and Nail decks in Standard instead of the Force, who was legal at the same time. These were even harder to deal with than the Force was, and their evasiveness generally allowed them to win the game in even fewer swings. It's been a pretty long time since Verdant Force could be called the best fatty ever printed, too. Eventually it got overtaken by a new big bad green creature to cheat into play with Natural Order, that being Craterhoof Behemoth. This creature buffs the entire board in a big way and usually wins the game the turn it comes down. This is what is usually expected of creatures you cheat into play these days. Just grinding out some value with saprolings isn't enough. Still, the elf deck strategy of cheating the behemoth into play with Natural Order is something of a descendant of the Secret Force deck. So, Verdant Force is largely irrelevant these days, but like we saw with Morphling last week, its legacy as an iconic Magic card has meant that we see cards that reference it all the time, most notably in a cycle of Force Elementals in each of Magic's other colors. All of them cost 5 generic and 3 mana of one color, they are 7/7s, and they give you a color-appropriate trigger during every upkeep. These 4 newer forces were printed in Commander 2011 and Commander 2013. Obviously enough, cards in this cycle, including Verdant Force, are way better in Commander, which is generally a multiplayer format where there are a lot more upkeeps for you to get value out of. So let's sum things up. Verdant Force was one of the best creatures to cheat into play in Block, Standard, and Extended between 1998 and 2003. During this time, it achieved 7 World Top 8s, including 1 win, 6 Pro Tour Top 8s, and 2 Regional or Grand Prix Top 8s. It, along with Spirit of the Night, was the game's very first competitive reanimation target, and this strategy was so powerful that Recurring Nightmare got banned in Standard. A few years later, it emerged as a win condition in Extended decks, where it became the first win condition for Natural Order decks, while also resuming its role as a powerful reanimation target. So while Verdant Force may not look like a powerhouse today, it was one of the best creatures in the entire game for about half a decade, and its sheer power helped spawn brand new strategies that were all about putting it into play ahead of schedule. So that's the history of Verdant Force. If you want to own Verdant Force, Natural Order, or any other Magic cards, use my link in the description to check out Card Kingdom's store. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like it and share it to spread the word, and don't forget to vote on next week's poll in the community tab so you can help determine what I look at next. Thanks for watching.